Well, hey there, welcome to Overtime. My name is Jeremy, and Overtime is where we take Sunday's conversation further in hopes that it becomes more helpful for you in your life and your faith. And I'm sitting here with Buck Giebelhaus, our lead pastor. Buck, it's been a little while since we've had you on the podcast.
Yes.
Jordan, taught a good chunk of the mental health series.
Very grateful.
We had Rick on the podcast. How are you doing? How's life?
Life is moving. Yes. I mean, I survived the winter storm.
Yes, that's
so,
good.
My family and I had a little camping trip indoors. And so that was kind of cool. But I mean, what's amazing is I know Jordan's been teaching and I haven't been on the podcast a while, but I feel like I've been busier. I feel like I'm like, man, I still feel like, gosh, I've been active and, man, I feel like I'm working more than ever. And, I just feel like busier. So I'm like, okay, well.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I thought about you guys during the winter storm because, you have three fully grown men, really. 4, including yourself.
Right.
And then you have 2 growing boys.
Yeah.
It's like, how are you guys rationing food?
Well, that and the toilet situation was, definitely. When you have 7 people, the numbers, think about the numbers. And so we had our bathtub full of water. We had 5-gallon buckets. And so
I went through that in a day, pretty much.
Yeah, I was a little nervous.
Yeah.
These are like real things. I'm like, the volume of water and food and restroom usage is pretty high with larger numbers. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's good. I'm glad y'all are all, you made it through. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, and I appreciate you thinking about me.
Yeah, absolutely. This past week, we started a new series called Welcome Home, and it's a conversation about eternity. And this is a big topic. Lots of thoughts, lots of questions. One thing that you shared was that you are deathly afraid of being eaten to death. And that makes sense. But then you specifically said anacondas, and it felt a little random to me. Is there a specific reason it's anacondas? There's a story behind that?
Well, I don't know. My mind will run sometimes, and you have experienced that where it just keeps running. And so, I think there's the natural, like being eaten by a shark. Like I visualize that. It's terrible. And so I have to jump out of that and go, quit thinking about that, or being eaten by a bear. There's a movie, I forgot, with Leonardo DiCaprio, and he was like being attacked by a bear, something like this. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. Anyways, so that scene didn't sit well with me. And then I watched the movie, I think it's called Anaconda. And I think it's like in the 90s, and they were on, some river in like Brazil or South
the
America.
Amazon.
Yeah.
Where they're known for, yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm watching this movie, and the anacondas are everywhere, and they're massive. They're taking down boats and, eating people, and you see these big visuals. So anyways, I don't know why that is most,
Just struck a chord for you.
That is I'm just picturing myself being swallowed by an anaconda and being conscious.
Good Lord.
It is terrible. And this is why I'm this is where my mind goes, it's overactive. It's too much. And I'm like, gosh, I got to get back from there. So as I picture, it is my greatest fear of death, of going if I was to die. But, as I said on Sunday, if you do a little research, the probability of that's really, really low. And being eaten by anaconda, I didn't do the research on that. What's the probability of, going out that way?
Got to be very small.
It seems like, especially because I'm not around them.
Yeah.
They're not my backyard or.
Yeah, the probability is much smaller when you're not in the Amazon.
Yeah, but it's probably a combination of the movie and an active imagination that impacted my fear.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, you also said other things other
Yes.
than anacondas and all that.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you said, but before we jump in, there was kind of a realization for our creative team as we shot the bumper video, the video before the message, because we just went to Georgetown Square, and we thought Georgetown Square, we're going to get, Georgetown's kind of outside of the city. We're going to get, there's a lot of churches around Georgetown.
More conservative.
Yeah, we thought, oh, surely we're going to get, a lot of, more Jesus-y answers.
Sure.
And we literally spent, 45 minutes, and we asked 10 people, and they were very willing to just be on camera and say, here's what I think happens after I die. And we were so surprised at the variety of answers that we got. Some people just, you could tell they hadn't really ever put it to words what they believed, because
Right.
they were fumbling over their words and they were thinking about it and processing it. You could tell there was a lot of hope for people, like, well, I don't know, but I hope that I get to see my family, and I hope it's, there's peace and there's all that. The dogs one was funny. There were these two guys that, we went up to him and we said, hey, can we do this? And one of them said, sure, yeah, I'll do it. And he shared that, he hopes there's a heaven. He hopes that it's something that's like better than this life,
Sure.
but he doesn't know for sure. And he likes to believe that like he's going to go there one day. And then the other guy said it's blackness. Like
Right.
you die and
Nothing.
your lights are out, nothing. You just live the best life you can here, because once you're done, you're done. And walking away from them, I had this thought of like, oh man, did I just create like a really awkward conversation between those two friends? Because they clearly believe something a little bit different. And I'm guessing they've never talked about it, because it was kind of a surprise to both of them when they shared their answers. And, it just kind of brought to light this fact that we don't ever talk about this, and it's a weird thing to talk about. Why don't you think we talk about it? And why do you think, why is that so prevalent in our society today?
Yeah, well, I first will just kind of go back to what you're saying and just give a little bit of the why behind our vision. Oftentimes, if you've been coming to North Point a while, you've heard me talk about, hey, 8 out of 10 people in Austin, a city that changes the world, aren't engaged in church. And, by nature of that, there's a lot of confusion around Jesus. There's a lot of confusion around the Bible, a lot of confusion around eternity. And so, oh my gosh, what an incredible opportunity we have as a church to be in a city that changes the world, Austin, Texas. And I listened to a Rogan Elon podcast I was telling you about the other day.
Yeah.
And Elon, he said in the next 30 years, Austin is going to become the city of all cities. He said it's going to be like the city, like there's no other city like it, like New York, LA. Nothing will compare to what Austin will become and has the ingredients of today. So, again, it's one of those things to go like, wow, like what we've been talking about the last 12 years, it's true.
Yeah, and people are noticing it. People are moving here.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
And in this city, 8 out of 10 people don't engage in church.
Yep.
And that's 1.6 to 1.8 million people.
Which, by the way, was so true, because we interviewed about 10 people.
Right.
And we got 2 Jesus answers.
Yeah.
And 8 out of 10 people were not.
That was my point,
Yeah.
is to go, we went to a very conservative place, you would imagine, downtown Georgetown, on the square. You're thinking most people are maybe Jesus people, Christian people, conservative folks. And 8 out of 10 of them in that space were very confused or had, in terms of like, what is heaven? What is eternity? Jesus. And so I just thought, man, it's one of those things to go, if you're listening, I really hope, and you're part of North Point, I really hope that you would go like, man, this is so important. Our vision to create a church, that people who aren't engaged in church would love to engage with, that is so important and so relevant in a city that can change the world. So that was the first thing from the bumper video, but I know that's not the question you asked me. I think I think there's some like really practical reasons why eternity is something we don't talk about a bunch. I think, there's confusion. If I'm confused about something, or I don't have good answers about it, or, I'm unsure about it, it may be a place I just don't talk about a lot, because I just don't have a lot to say. It's just, I don't know, I think that, there's practical reasons. I think it's a fear. I think if it's the unknown, and there's so much that the church has done well and the church has done not well in painting pictures of eternity, and I think that can create some fear, incite some fear. So like I'm afraid to even go there to talk about it. I think multiple religions have multiple views of eternity, and so I think that creates the confusion around that, and maybe some of the fear. And so I think from a very practical perspective, there's a lot of that, the unknowns, the fears, the misconceptions, the things that maybe our mom or dad or religious leader taught us. And so we just avoid it. It's just, it takes a whole lot of energy when there's a lack of clarity. And I would just say in the midst of all of that, I think in the first century and today in the 21st century, Jesus is more relevant than ever in this conversation. Like Jesus came to clear so many things up about life, about God, about ourselves, about relationships, about our struggles, about where happiness and joy and peace can be found. And he also cleared up so much confusion when it comes to eternity. And so I'm really excited about this series. I'm really excited about the conversation. And my hope is that we can just really kind of fix our eyes on him and go, like, what do you have to say about eternity? Because everybody's got an opinion about it.
Yeah.
And, from dogs to, it's nothing. But I'm most interested, and I hope together we can be most interested to go like, well, what's Jesus' thoughts? Because Jesus said, I have come from heaven. I am the bread of life. I've come from heaven. So he knows.
Yep.
He's the only one I'm aware who said, I have come from eternity, and I'm here to provide you with a picture of that. Mm-hmm. And the way he speaks and teaches, if you read it from that context, like next time if you open the Bible, if you read the Bible, like read his teachings from an eternal perspective, and you're like, dang, this guy talks about it all the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure. You said something in there that I think is really relevant, but not thought about very often. We all have an opinion about eternity. Mm-hmm. I makes me think of Blaise Pascal, who lived, hundreds of years ago, philosopher, mathematician, theologian, physicist. I mean, he was like brilliant guy. Mm-hmm. And he has this whole thing about, Pascal's wager is what it's called. And if you're listening, and you can go look it up and read it, it's really fascinating. But he essentially says that, like, regardless of whether or not we've made a conscious decision about what we believe about eternity and God and all mm-hmm. those things, like, we are living our life in such a way that we have chosen something. Mm-hmm. And at the end of our life, on our deathbed, like, we will have chosen either mm-hmm. belief or non-belief. Mm-hmm. Like, we just can't get away from it at that point. And so it is interesting. And I hope this series really causes people who perhaps have, like, maybe not intentionally believed one thing, but have felt like they aren't believing anything. When we don't believe anything, we are believing something mm-hmm. in that act. And so my hope throughout this series is that people would take steps of belief one mm-hmm. way or the other. They would just go like, here's what I really believe.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, you touch on something, and I'm going to touch on it throughout the series, especially in part 2, is that, God does give us a part of our will that is free. And, doctrinally, theologically, I would lean this way. Not everybody does, but I just can't get away from it in the scriptures. I can't get away from it in what's experientially true around me, what I see. And so, there is a component of our will that God will not violate, that is 100% free to choose or to trust him, to love him, or choose not to trust him. But there is that component that I think every human being has that says, what am I going to do? What am I going to choose about eternity? Am mm-hmm. I going to research it? Am I going to look into it? Is there a solution to it? Are there answers there? And we are genuinely free. And God gives us that freedom to be exercised on how we see fit. And so I think that's a really interesting piece of this. And so, I love what you say, and, what Blaise Pascal and, that whole story, we do have that freedom to choose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, Solomon writes in Proverbs that eternity is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, mm-hmm. one of them. Eternity is written on eternity is written on man's heart. Like mm-hmm. meaning we have questions. Mm-hmm. All of us do, mm-hmm. and that's just a natural part of being human. And one of the places I've seen that the most, and I think part of the reason, going back to my first question of like, why do you think it's so uncommon for us to have conversations about this, is because I think in Western society today, like, life is relatively really, really good. From a financial standpoint, we live in the top, 1% of the entire world. Yeah. And I've experienced this when we've traveled to Kenya, and we've met a lot of the people in Kenya, Africa, with the Fountain of Life Church, the orphanage we're partnered with at North Point. Mm-hmm. And we've met these kiddos and these people, and they're so dang happy, and they have faith bigger than I ever thought possible. Yeah. And it kind of opens your eyes to, wow, when you don't have all those things that make life good here mm-hmm. in this life, you think more about, is there a bigger life than this? When there's mm-hmm. poverty and sickness and death all around you, it causes you to ask those questions. Is there something more? Mm-hmm. Much more than we do in Western society, which is why I think it's more uncommon and more uncomfortable than it's ever been, because here our life is relatively really good, mm-hmm. right?
100%.
Which kind of leads me to my next question. You talked a lot about near-death experiences, mm-hmm. and I think, there's a ton of research behind it, and there's a lot of fascinating stuff. So many great books have been written about it. Mm-hmm. So many people who were very, very skeptical and began to research it, and then were no longer skeptical because the research was just flooring to them.
Sure.
But I know for people who are hearing about it for the first time, again, going back to that idea of we live in Western society, life is good, we don't think about eternity mm-hmm. As often as some others do. Near-death experiences, all of this can feel like a fairy tale. Mm-hmm. What would you say to somebody who's a bit caught up in getting to that place where they can truly believe there is something after we die. And it doesn't feel like a fairy tale. They can really go, I do believe that, and here's why.
Yeah, if I'm hearing your question right, I think, I said this on Sunday a couple times, just chase the evidence. There's a great book by Josh McDowell that's written in terms of more of like Christian apologetics, or is there a reason to believe? And it's titled "Evidence That Demands a Verdict." And I loved it because he's I think he's a lawyer. I could be wrong on that, but he just chased it from a law perspective to go, okay, if I had to prove the case that Jesus is who he claimed to be, and eternity's real, the Bible's real, the whole thing, I had to prove that in a court of law. How would I do that? And so his whole book is written based on that. And he chases the evidence, and he says the evidence demands a verdict that what Jesus said is true. And that who Jesus claimed to be, it's true, and that eternity is true, and the Bible is reliable. And so it's a really interesting read, but it makes me think about, your question to go, there's evidence out there. There are things out there. I don't think God has left us alone. And so, as you said, like on NDE stories, I think John Burke, who's here in Austin at Gateway Church, he's a great pastor. I've gotten to connect with him several times. He wrote a book. I think it's a New York Times bestseller called Imagine Heaven.
Yeah.
And he really goes more in the NDE side of things. Like he talks about near-death experiences. He talks about how there's like this weird stigma that like for him to share it, he's been interested, I think since his dad or his mom passed away from cancer. He grew up in more of I think an agnostic home. And so he just started researching this and hearing all these stories and interviewing people. And it's a fascinating read. And so I would say read things like that. I think,
I read it. I'll just interject this.
Yeah.
I read it. We were driving to Florida, and we had a 12-hour drive, and we drove through the night. So we left at 10 p.m.
Goodness.
And which is a different conversation here and there. But I powered through the entire book, and Ashley was sleeping the whole time, and my mind was blown.
Yeah.
I mean, it was such a fascinating book,
Right.
especially just to listen to it the whole way through. It was incredible. So if anybody's listening, Imagine Heaven, you got to go check that out. It's a great listen.
I think it's a great book. I think Dr. Jeffrey Long, if you look him up on Google, which I would highly recommend, he's written some books. I think Evidence of the Afterlife, which I talked about on Sunday. But he also has, I think it's the largest website that contains stories about near-death experiences. And so he entered in as a skeptic, going, I'm hearing too many of these stories as an oncologist. What's happening? And so I think he references Dr. Michael Sabin, who I referenced on Sunday as well. Dr. Michael Sabin really approached it as there is no eternity, there is no God. I'm tired of these NDE stories. There's a scientific explanation. It's simply hallucinations. So I think I would just say chase the evidence. And then I think also in terms of eternity, chase the evidence of Jesus. If you don't believe in him, that's fine. Just go research, what does he have to say about eternity? And does that correlate with some of the things that we're seeing, that people are experiencing? So as people are in NDE experiences, or they recall their NDE experiences, and then they document them, does that correlate with what Jesus teaches in terms of eternity? I think that's an interesting angle. And then, another book I'd recommend is Randy Alcorn, which, a lot of what we're talking about in this series is based off his book called Heaven. He's got one really large book called Heaven. If you can make it through that, I'll give you $10. So if somebody can make it through it, then I'll just ask you for the $10 and I'll give it to them. But it is a textbook kind of book, very repetitive, but fascinating in terms of eternity, and just begins to open your mind and how much the scriptures and how much the disciples and how much Jesus and how much from the Old Testament to the New Testament talk about eternity. So I would just say, I would look at the evidence from that. And then, I said this on Sunday, but I would also just say to invite God in. And again, even if you're I don't believe God exists. Okay, well, just on the chance he does, would you be willing to just go, God, if you are real and if eternity is real, would you reveal that to me? And I really want everyone to take that seriously, regardless if you're a Christian or not, over the next 4 weeks. And then, as I said on Sunday, look for it. Look for it. I promise God will answer that prayer, and I think he will begin to show you evidence or glimpses or reminders or resources or things that are very tangible and concrete of eternity is real, God is real, Jesus is real, and he's inviting you into an incredible relationship where you can feel loved and forgiven and know your eternity is secure. And I think God will reveal that to anyone who earnestly is looking.
Yeah. No, that's really, really good. Throughout the series, we are opening it up for people to ask questions about heaven because there are so many questions. And so we've opened up a little text platform to where, if you're listening or watching, you can text overtime to 97000 and you can ask a question. And so you'll get a text back and it just says, hey, just put your text right here. And then you send it back to that same text message again. And we're going to tackle it throughout overtime, throughout the rest of the series. But we did get one question in this week, and it's a bit of a lengthy one. And I love that, they're coming with here's some of the things in the Bible, and here's kind of the question, how do I reconcile these things? I'm just going to read the question and try to kind of get through the whole thing because there's a lot to it. Yeah. But then we'll end it at the end of the question, and then hopefully you can provide some clarity to it as well. But here's what one person said. They said, based on my understanding of the Bible, those that are dead in Christ shall be raised up during the second coming, as described in 1 Thessalonians 4. Those that believe Christ died for their sins and was resurrected and ascended to make way for us to the Father, they fall asleep. Sleep is used to describe mortal death throughout the Old and the New Testament. Based on 1 Corinthians 15, the time between mortal death and ascension into heaven is a twinkling of the eye, quotation marks, similar to a good night's rest where there is no recollection of sleeping, just falling asleep and waking up. So kind of a question about that in-between period, falling asleep, dying, and then waking up. Can you explain the stance of an immediate transition from mortal life to eternal life?
Sure.
Great question, by the way, to whoever asked it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And so let me start a couple ways. One is just, we could deep dive and spend a long time on this question. And so whoever asked this, if we don't answer it to your satisfaction, ask, part 2 or part 3, because I really want to honor the question because it's a great one. So I would tackle it a couple ways. One, soul sleep is something that has been around for a long time, and it is a belief that, that we basically go into an unconscious state when we die, and that some would go so far to say you cannot be a person without a body, so you need this resurrected body, and your spirit can, joined with the body will then give you life again, and so we must wait until until Jesus comes back and the return of Jesus, and that in between period between when you die and when Jesus returns is an unconscious state called soul sleep. And it's just like when you go to bed and, if you don't dream or if you forgot your dreams and you wake up, it's like, man, it's a twinkle of an eye. And so that's certainly a very shortened version of soul sleep. And so I would say I don't believe that. And the reason why I don't believe that are a couple reasons. One is, in school I learned about a process called hermeneutics, which is the science of interpretation of Scripture, and it's really important. The word sleep is oftentimes a euphemism that is described, like Paul used it a lot, to go like when somebody dies, you look at their body and it appears they're sleeping, and it would be a more culturally acceptable way to say death than to call it death. Like death would be a harsh way to say that person's dead. You could say that, and he did at times, but also it was also used as a euphemism to go like, hey, they're sleeping. And that was a very common term in the first century, and that's used interchangeably with death. So I think that's important in terms of the description of it. I think also when you look at the Old Testament, and there's some references to where it seems as though, Solomon in Ecclesiastes is talking about Sheol and sleep, and this idea to go, and the context of that, again, the hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, would say that he's talking about under the sun. So it's this idea of saying, hey, everything under the sun, not death, but it's in the context of in this world, what we see. I think, in Psalms, there's a reference to sleeping when it comes to death, but that's not talking about literal physical death. That's talking about a spiritual death. Like you are sleeping in terms of this idea of being spiritually alive, spiritually awakened, that it appears that you are sleeping. So the context is really important. And so that's a very brief touch to kind of go from the hermeneutical side of as you see the word sleep, that lends itself to go, gosh, are we sleeping? It's important to do the science of interpretation to go, what is the context? What is the actual word? What is the cultural context? Was that a common phrase in that day to describe something that's very similar?
Yeah.
So I think that's first. And then I think, I wrote down a couple passages. I think, as you go through the scriptures again and again and again, it talks about you die and you're with God. You die and your spirit's alive. Paul in 2 Corinthians 5, which I talked about on Sunday, said, you die and you're given a new heavenly body. So this idea to go, hey, you can't be alive without your soul and a body. Paul says God gives you a heavenly body. Now, I don't have time or, to go into like what is your kind of new heavenly body in the new earth and all this kind of stuff, which is fascinating to talk about. Randy Elkhorn talks about that in his book Heaven. That would be a great resource to get more insight. But there is the body that you are joined with, so you're simply not a spirit. You have your touch, your smell, your taste, your cognitive abilities. Like you are given a new heavenly body, as Paul talks about. And he talks about that you die, boom, you're given a new heavenly body. I think in Philippians 1 it says, Paul says, it's better, to depart to be with Christ. So he is saying, man, I have purpose here, but I long to be there. It's better to be there with Christ. So if soul sleep is correct, then the idea to go, I long to be in an unconscious state. And like that, it wouldn't fit the context again. Like Paul is saying, man, I long to be in his presence. Like I'm there. I know that, away from the body, I am with God. And that's what he says, like in 2 Corinthians 5:6, he says, I'm home in the body and I'm away from the Lord, so that I'm here now, I'm away from God. So, but when I'm done with this body, I am with the Lord. So again, the context would say, immediately there is no period of sleep, you are with God. I think, I referenced on, Sunday, Luke 23, the criminal dies and Jesus says, hey, today, not, after a period of time, not after an age or, some sort of a gap. Like today, you will be with me in heaven in eternity. So Jesus references, you're going to be there. And then the last point I would just say, Revelation 6, 9 through 10, it's a wild verse talking about the seals and the Lamb who broke, finally could open the seals. Everybody was waiting for, who's going to open it? Who's going to open it? Christ steps up and he's opening it. But my point with that is, as you read Revelation, as you read what's going to happen in eternity, what's going to happen in, if you will, like end times, every reference in Revelation to human beings and is talking about worshiping in heaven prior to the resurrection, or prior to Christ coming back. So all of these references are showing people who have died are in the presence of the Lord and fully awake and very real. And so again, I would just say, great question. I think it's a legitimate question. I just think if you take Scripture in its entirety, I think you would go like, I really believe like, when we die, Scripture points to the fact that we are most alive. As I said on Sunday, death is a doorway, to home.
Yeah, no, I guess it would make sense, if we're talking about NDEs, that, people would be in that doorway and would see something. It wouldn't just be blackness right there, unconscious state, that kind of thing too.
Correct.
Yeah. Last question to wrap up. You said how we view eternity influences how we live today. So depending on how we view what's going to happen when there is no more today in this life, it's going to determine the decisions we make, the actions we take today and tomorrow and for the rest of our, physical body time. Why is this the case? And can you give some examples and how that plays itself out for you?
Well, so I'll share like just my personal insight. So, there's scripture that says, everything will be laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. This is like old school religion. This is like old school church. It's like, but it's real. And everything I have chosen will be laid before the eyes of Jesus Christ, to whom I must give an account for my life.
Yeah.
That makes me think. That causes a pause. Like, okay, like I want to do this. I feel like I want to do this. My coping, my brokenness, everything wants to do this. But like, I will be accountable for my choices, all good and all bad. So eternity brings the reality of our choices, or it gives us clarity of the reality of our choices to go, wow, there is not only a immediate impact that I could experience. There's not only an earthly impact that I can experience, but there's also an eternal impact. And I'm going to unpack this more in part 4 when I talk about rewards. Mm-hmm. So this is not if you get into heaven or not. I'm not talking about that like, I didn't do a loving thing, so now I don't get into heaven. That has everything to do with belief in Jesus and where your faith and dependence are. This is much more about reward. This is much more about like what heaven will be like. As a result of my choices. So eternity brings my choices into perspective, but eternity also gives me an incredible amount of peace. So I think about my mom, tragic, grief, a sadness that I can't even fully describe. But in the midst of that, Paul says in Thessalonians that we're not to grieve like ordinary men. Why? Because eternity. Like grieve. Like be human, be real. I think we should. Mm-hmm. But we don't have to do that without hope. We don't have to do that without the idea to go, I will see my mom again. I know it. And the reason I know it is because eternity brings that into perspective. It gives me the clarity to say, yes, my heart is crushed. Yes, I am grieving. But I'm not going to grieve without hope. And I know I have hope. I will see her again.
Yeah.
And I will, embrace her again. I will see her face again. I will have conversations again. And eternity brings that level of hope and peace into my daily life. I think about tragedies and hardships that I experience and sit on the other side of individuals who experience. The passages that say God works all things for the good. Well, that's really kind of cute and special for pastors to say and religious leaders to say. But when eternity is brought up, that brings context to that statement to say we are finite, we have a limited amount of time. Time is a prerequisite to understand the big picture and how all things fit together. Eternity provides the context. So when we stand in eternity and we actually see God in his loving, fair, just, perfect, his holiness, and we see how all the threads of life, good and bad, fit together for something that is beautiful, that we all will declare when we see the big picture that, oh, I didn't know. I was trusting this day would come. Like eternity gives that kind of peace to say, man, whatever I'm facing, good or bad, God, I know you're working. And I know one day, not today, maybe not in this lifetime, I'll see how all these pieces fit together. But in eternity, I will see. And that gives me perseverance. That gives me peace. And I have pulled on that over and over and over in times of grief, in times of daily choices, and in times of tragedies or hardships in my life.
Yeah. I think it's super practical. I mean, it's becoming a little bit of a cliche to say 2020, the year was, so difficult, but it was. And, we're still living in a pandemic. And thinking about eternity, and really, a big chunk of the reason why we decided to do this series in the first place is because when you have a heavenly perspective, the problems of today become a lot smaller, and you kind of go, "Wow, God, this is tough. This is hard." But I'm so grateful that one day I'm going to experience a peace that surpasses all understanding, and it's not going to be something that's fleeting and I try to hold on to, but I keep losing. It's going to be real and relevant, and being with Jesus and being with God.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the more we can think about eternity, the more we keep eternity in view. The more we experience that perpetual state of peace.
Yeah.
That peace that, Paul talks about that transcends all understanding. Like, we long for that.
Yeah.
But that's a reality that we can experience. But it does require us to get a clearer picture on the reality of eternity. And so that's why I'm really excited about this series.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been a great way to unpack part 1. And I'm excited for the rest of the series, knowing what we're going to be unpacking. And this week in particular, it's going to continue to get a little bit uncomfortable. But I think a healthy uncomfortability is not a word, healthy discomfort.
I liked it, though.
Yeah, it's good. And we're going to jump into part 2 this week. Make sure to submit your questions if you have them. Again, text OVERTIME to 97000. And we're going to be jumping into part 2 this week. So, Buck, thanks for being part of the podcast.
Thank you, my friend.